Reforms are the key to relevance, says Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He was speaking at the Summit of the Future at the United Nations in New York. Now, this was a very brief address, barely about 4.5 minutes. The Prime Minister told world leaders that success of humanity lies in our collective strength and not in the battlefield. He gave the example of the India story, 1/6 of humanity, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi mentioned how 250 million people had been lifted out of poverty and that India was willing to share that knowledge, expertise and experience and all the efforts made by India to lift 250 million people out of poverty with the global south or other developing countries. He insisted on the need to reform global institutions to remain relevant. He gave the example of India's G20 presidency and how the African Union was made a part of the G20. I'm Gaurav Sawant. We get you all details. Also, the implications of the Prime Minister's visit to the United States of America, especially the Quad Summit. Day 3 of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States, and the focus was his address at the United Nations Summit of the Future. Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke of India's successful sustainable development goals going hand in hand with people being lifted out of poverty. The Prime Minister said that in India, 250 million people had been lifted out of poverty and emphasized on the need to reform organizations to remain relevant. He gave the example of India's successful G20 presidency, where the African Union was made a part of the G20, indicating the need to reform organizations. He spoke of the existing threat of terror to humankind, but he also emphasized on the emerging threats to humankind in the fields of cyber, space, and the maritime domain. Prime Minister Narendra Modi insisted global action must match global ambition. Let's listen in.
जून में अभी मानव इतिहास के सबसे बड़े चुनावों में भारत के लोगों ने मुझे लगातार तीसरी बार सेवा का अवसर दिया है और आज मैं इसी 1/6 ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी की आवाज आप तक पहुंचाने यहां आया हूं। फ्रेंड्स, जब हम ग्लोबल फ्यूचर की बात कर रहे हैं तो ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच सर्वप्रथम होनी चाहिए। सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट को प्राथमिकता देते हुए हमें मानव कल्याण, फूड, हेल्थ सिक्योरिटी यह भी सुनिश्चित करनी होगी। भारत में 250 मिलियन लोगों को गरीबी से बाहर निकालकर हमने यह दिखाया है कि सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट कैन बी सक्सेसफुल। सक्सेस का हमारा यह अनुभव हम ग्लोबल साउथ के साथ साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। फ्रेंड्स, success of humanity lies in our collective strength, not in the battlefield. और वैश्विक शांति एवं विकास के लिए ग्लोबल संस्थाओं में रिफॉर्म्स आवश्यक है। रिफॉर्म इज द की टू रिलेवेंस। अफ्रीकन यूनियन को नई दिल्ली समिट में G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता इसी दिशा में एक महत्वपूर्ण कदम था। वैश्विक शांति और सुरक्षा के लिए एक तरफ आतंकवाद जैसा बड़ा खतरा है तो दूसरी तरफ साइबर, मैरीटाइम, स्पेस जैसे अनेक संघर्ष के नए नए मैदान भी बन रहे हैं। इन सभी विषयों पर मैं जोर देकर कहूंगा कि ग्लोबल एक्शन मस्ट match global ambition. Friends, टेक्नोलॉजी के सेफ और रिस्पॉन्सिबल यूज के लिए बैलेंस रेगुलेशन की आवश्यकता है. हमें ऐसी ग्लोबल डिजिटल गवर्नेंस चाहिए जिसमें राष्ट्रीय संप्रभुता और अखंडता अक्षुण्ण रहे. डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर शुड बी ए ब्रिज, नॉट अ बैरियर. ग्लोबल गुड के लिए भारत अपना डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पूरे विश्व से साझा करने के लिए तैयार है. फ्रेंड्स, भारत के लिए वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर एक कमिटमेंट है. यही कमिटमेंट हमारे वन अर्थ, वन हेल्थ और वन सन, वन वर्ल्ड, वन ग्रिड जैसे इनिशिएटिव्स में भी दिखाई देता है. पूरी मानवता के हितों की रक्षा और वैश्विक समृद्धि के लिए भारत मनसा वाचा कर्मणा से काम करता रहेगा.
And India Today's Rohit Sharma now joins us from New York for more on the Prime Minister's address. And Rohit, when we look at the manner in which the Prime Minister talks about the need to reform organizations, he gives the example how India was able to reform the G20, bring the African Union in, lifting 250 million people out of poverty. So it's all that India has been able to do, the world must do. If their ambition must match all the words, their commitment should all be there. What's the response to what the Prime Minister said?
Well, absolutely. I think he was giving an example of what India has been able to achieve in its own personal capacity, right? I mean, UN has been a body for over 79 years. They haven't really done any reform. I mean, Prime Minister talked about how Global South, India looks at Global South. They were able to admit the African Union into the G20. He's sort of saying the fact that, ambition to include all these things and do all these things that UN talks about should be matched with our actions. And he was giving an example of how India has been a leader in doing that and achieving the goals that it set out to do. So I think Prime Minister making a very forceful statement there. He also talked about lifting people from poverty and then identifying other areas that we always talk about: maritime security, there's terrorism, there is cybersecurity, there is space security. These things we hear about in bilateral meetings and all that. But I think what he wants to do and what he wanted to lay down is his vision of what the Summit for Future should look like. It should include these things in a meaningful manner and just not words and sentences. And I think that's what Prime Minister did forcefully when he said that. And he said towards the end of his speech that I want to stress on this. So I think it was a very, very powerful speech from the Prime Minister. This is Summit for the Future. Again, people are trying to understand how can they reform the United Nations, and I think a lot of people wanted to listen from the Prime Minister, and he delivered a very concise but a very powerful speech.
It's the voice of 1/6 of humanity, plus taking the global south along. That's been India's effort throughout. Rohit, for joining me here, many thanks. Now, the Prime Minister has had a series of meetings. He's met all the tech CEOs talking about what artificial intelligence can do, how India can be a semiconductor manufacturing hub. He's addressed the Indian diaspora. He's spoken of India's success story. But perhaps the Quad Summit, one of the most important legs of his 3-day visit to the United States of America. And when questions were asked of US President Joe Biden, will Quad have the same momentum post-November? He looked at Prime Minister Narendra Modi and indicated absolutely. Will India now, in a way, take Quad forward? And does this send out a major signal to China? We bring you this report.
The Quad Summit, hosted by US President Joe Biden in his hometown of Wilmington in Delaware, sent out the grouping's sharpest message yet to China without naming it. A joint statement by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio and President Biden said the four countries seek to uphold the international order based on the rule of the law. The Wilmington Declaration said the Quad stands for the maintenance of peace and stability across Indo-Pacific. They strongly oppose any destabilizing or unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo by force or coercion. The Quad seeks a region where no country dominates and no country is dominated, a region where all countries are free from coercion and can exercise their agency to determine their futures. The four-nation group announced a new regional maritime initiative for training in the Indo-Pacific called MATRI to monitor and secure waters, enforce laws and deter unlawful behavior. India will be hosting the inaugural MATRI workshop in 2025. The Coast Guards of the four countries also plan to launch a first-ever Quad at Sea ship observer mission in 2025. The summit shed any ambiguity and made it clear that Quad is here to stay.
हमारी बैठक ऐसे समय हो रही है जब विश्व तनावों और संघर्षों से घिरा हुआ है। ऐसे में साझा डेमोक्रेटिक वैल्यूज के आधार पर क्वाड का मिलकर साथ चलना पूरी मानवता के लिए बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण है। फ्री, ओपन, इंक्लूसिव और प्रॉस्परस इंडो पैसिफिक हमारी साझा प्राथमिकता और साझा प्रतिबद्धता है।
While China was not mentioned in the statement, President Biden was caught on the microphone saying China continues to behave aggressively, testing us all across the region.
Mr. President, will the Quad survive beyond the election in November? The Quad, will it survive regardless of the outcome?
Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US was also marked by the increasing cooperation between the two countries. India and the US will also set up a national security semiconductor plant.
AI का मतलब है अमेरिकन, इंडियन, अमेरिका, इंडिया, ये स्पिरिट है और वही तो नई दुनिया का AI पावर है। यही AI स्पिरिट भारत अमेरिका रिश्तों को नई ऊंचाई दे रहा है।
The Quad Declaration on Indo-Pacific comes amidst China's efforts to encircle India in its neighborhood. This weekend, another unknown was added to the equation. Sri Lanka got its first communist president in Anurakumara Dissanayake. Bureau Report, India Today.
So, what was the message from the fourth in-person Quad summit? What's the biggest signal to expansionist forces from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's US visit? He spoke of India's success story, had a detailed meeting with top CEOs, but what are key takeaways? Joining me on this special broadcast is Ambassador Veena Sikri, a former top diplomat, and Sushant Sareen is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Ambassador Sikri, was this the sharpest yet message to China without naming China, or is there an apprehension post-Biden Quad will not remain as relevant?
I think, first of all, the Quad's relevance seems to me to be assured by the depth of the initiatives that they have outlined in the Wilmington Declaration, and they are determined to continue. I think, Prime Minister Modi does represent the future of Quad in the sense that President Biden will not be there after November. Prime Minister Kishida of Japan is also not going to be there very soon, and Prime Minister Albanese is facing an election very soon. So I think, I think it is a lot is going to be on the shoulders of Prime Minister Modi to carry forward this initiative that has been spelled out, that has been fleshed out. The details have been given out. For example, the focus that it is now from the Indian Ocean And the
Yes.
mention of the IORA is there, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, right till the Pacific Islands Forum, which is at the very, eastern end. So the length and breadth of the Indo-Pacific has been spelled out. This is very important. India and US are going to have bilateral cooperation in the Indian Ocean as well, including the navies, right at the Middle East and in the waterways and so on. So I think that the coming together of the bilateral visit, the decisions of the bilateral visit, the Quad Summit, and the decisions of the Quad Summit, this has been really reinforcing each other. And it's very important to see four largest maritime democracies, coming together at the summit level and making these important declarations. The Coast Guard cooperating.
6 summits, 4 in person. Okay, Sushant Sareen, has India shed, initially people said India was a little hesitant, it's not a military grouping and so on, but will Prime Minister Narendra Modi be steering Quad, not just in the next 1 year, which is India's presidency, but in more ways than one, be the guiding force?
Look, I don't know whether we'll be the guiding force or not, but I think we will continue to remain a very, very important pillar of the Quad. In fact, out of the 4, we are one. And the second thing is, look, there is whatever skepticism there is on how the Quad will unfold in the future with leadership changes in some of the countries. This is not a leader-driven grouping. This is a grouping which has been driven or which is being driven by the establishments of the countries. This is something which comes, which is very intrinsic to all of the countries, that they feel that their interests are best served by coming together. So yeah, there will be some ups and downs. Maybe if Donald Trump comes in, incidentally, even while Donald Trump was there, it was not as though Quad was consigned to some kind of backwaters. It remained a very important entity even then. And I think if it is Kamala Harris, there will be certainly continuity on the American side. The Australians and the Japanese are committed to Quad. So the Quad will stay. On India's role in Quad, Gaurav, it's very interesting if you look at this latest Quad summit. India's hesitation on getting into a kind of a military alliance seems to be paring away. I think some of the understandings which have been reached in this Quad drives us closer to a kind of a military understanding between all the countries than what it was in the past. It's a very slow pace. I think we are all looking and feeling each other. We are all trying to find out what are the terms of engagement in which we will get into some kind of a military grouping. But I think that remains at the back of everybody's mind, and India continues to progress on that count. So that is something you should not ignore. And finally, I think one of the big takeaways, you call it bilateral, you call it part of Quad, is this semiconductor complex which is now going to be set up in India. It's a huge development, and in fact,
I'll come to semiconductors in a moment and other non-military bilaterals and plurilaterals that we're talking about. But Ambassador Sikri, in case since Sushant Sareen raised that point, in case Donald Trump comes, will the momentum change or unlikely? That's point one, and point two: can a non-military grouping still checkmate China?
No, I think if President Donald Trump gets elected, I think there certainly will be no let-up in the momentum of Quad, because it is President Trump who started all this action against China, whether it is sanctions or whether it is, punitive action on something which actually President Biden has continued, even though he has initiated talks with China on some matters, but he has continued those sanctions, including issuing new ones today. So I think that the momentum of Quad is here to stay, particularly because the security threat aspect has been built up. There's an indication that some countries, we know what's been happening between Philippines and China in the South China Sea, and that's been very aggressive. And there is a mention here that none of the Quad countries want to be threatened. So I see the Quad momentum also continuing through the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And
Yes.
that brings together at the moment about 14 countries. And that has, 4 pillars: the trade pillar, the supply chain pillar, the clean energy pillar, and also the tax and anti-corruption pillar. And there have been 2 agreements on the IPEF, on the economic framework, that have been signed while Prime Minister Modi was there for the Quad Summit. So I do see an incremental momentum, which is focused on potential future threats and the readiness to meet them through the Maitri, the Coast Guard initiative, through naval cooperation and so on. And simultaneously, I see the gradual increasing involvement on the economic front, tying together the economic aspects of the economy. I do know that ASEAN has played a central role in all of this.
Yes, and Sushant Sareen, will this checkmate China? Because we've got a reaction coming in from China, which issued a statement saying Quad is just a tool being used by the US to contain Beijing, to contain China.
Yeah, but who's forced this upon the rest of the world? It's the Chinese action, the Chinese belligerence, which has prompted countries to start banding together to, in a manner of speaking, contain China. So the point is that if China was not being as aggressive, it was not being expansionist, it was not being predatory, then there would be no need for Quad. All these countries were actually doing a lot of business with the Chinese, including at a political level. But it's the Chinese bloody-mindedness which has prompted a grouping like the Quad. Because remember, Quad started way back, and then it went into a kind of a cold storage until everybody woke up to the reality that, of the fiction of the peaceful rise of China. There is nothing peaceful about China anymore. And the fact remains that if the Chinese are getting a little queasy about the Quad, I think so much the better for it. Now, Ambassador Sikri talks about the economic aspects of Quad. I think that is as critical as the military aspects of Quad. Because how is China actually expanding its footprint? It's throwing money around. It's throwing money all over the place. It's buying out support. It's catching people in debt trap diplomacy, all of that. So I think if the Quad countries and other countries aligned to the Quad can come up with better models of more sustainable development, which are economically feasible, so much the better for it. So much better the way you can counter China. You don't only have to do it militarily.
So the last 30 seconds I have on this part of the show, Ambassador Sikri, the point that Sushant Sareen very rightly raises is Quad, in a way, again with the IMEC, a counter to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. China has money, but so does Japan. America has the military might and the economic might. India has the goodwill. Is that how Quad is moving forward to checkmate BRI?
Well, I think, first of all, China has to realize that the world gave China the chance to grow and develop and become a democratic country to play its role on the world stage. But I think China just blew it by actually misusing all the technology that was given to them, by clearly showing that they want dominance, they don't want cooperation.
Yes.
So I think
they don't want peaceful coexistence, it seems. I have breaking news coming in. Stay with me for a moment. Israel continues to pound Lebanon. There's been a wave of fresh attacks on Lebanon. Big story coming in. More than 182 people have been killed in Israeli airstrikes into Lebanon, and Israel has warned Lebanon. It's warned its civilians to evacuate. Benjamin Netanyahu has said, vacate your homes, vacate those areas where there are weapon storage. We know those areas and we will target them. Israel will change the security balance. Listen in to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel.
I have a message for the people of Lebanon. Israel's war is not with you. It's with Hezbollah. For too long, Hezbollah has been using you as human shields. It placed rockets in your living rooms and missiles in your garage. Those rockets and missiles are aimed directly at our cities, directly at our citizens. To defend our people against Hezbollah strikes, we must take out those weapons. Now, starting this morning, the IDF has warned you to get out of harm's way. I urge you, take this warning seriously. Don't let Hezbollah endanger your lives and the lives of your loved ones. Don't let Hezbollah endanger Lebanon. Please, get out of harm's way now. Once our operation is finished, you can come back safely to your homes.
So get out of harm's way is what Benjamin Netanyahu is telling the people of Lebanon, even as information coming in just a moment ago that the death toll has now been revised and stands at 274 people killed in Israeli airstrikes into Lebanon.